Okay, so shall we stay in Iberia? So first of all, good morning to you all. Thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing this amazing congress. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present part of our research in one of my favorite subjects in archaeology. It's an honor to be among you all. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about concerns two archaeological sites that we've been working on in southern Portugal. They are both ditched enclosures. One of them has beakers and the other doesn't have any beakers. So even though we did had some presentations that summed up part of this information, I'm going to give you a general overview of what the Bell Beaker phenomenon looks like in Portugal at the current date. So far we have a minimum number of 257 sites with decorated Bell Beakers, and we have a total of 1,886 vessels and 2,726 sherds. Sometimes we are able to see how many vessels we have, sometimes we are only able to see the number of fragments. Just a quick note to mention that these maps only reference decorated Bell Beakers, so I'm excluding from them all the plain S-shaped vessels that are usually in Portugal assigned to different horizons, as we usually call them, but to me phenomena, namely the Ferradeira phenomenon that's usually in southern Portugal. From the 257 sites, 146 are located in the Portuguese Extremadura and Tagus Valley, while we only have 2 sites that were detected in Algarve. Beakers outside funerary contexts are quite common, although the contextual proportions may vary from north to south. So, if in the northern areas there is a prevalence of beakers in funerary contexts, in Extremadura there seems to be an equitable distribution between funerary and non-funerary contexts. In Alentejo, decorated bell beakers seem to predominate in non-funerary sites, a fact that basically illustrates the multiplicity of roles that these artifacts can acquire in the Portuguese territory. Focusing on the beaker expressions on ditched enclosures, decorated sherds were only detected in 5 sites of a general universe of 69 enclosures so far. They present different research rhythms, they have different sizes, different complexities, and possibly different chronologies. So temporalities, making it quite hard to establish reliable comparisons between these sites. Montoito is located in Redondo. It has a central sinuous ditch with a gate that is open to the south. It is surrounded by an external ellipsoidal double ditch with an interruption that's orientated with the southwest. A section was made in one of these exterior ditches in 2015, and we were only able to recover a Simpos Velus sherd. In Alcalar, in Portimão, we have found 3 international vessels, and they apparently came from depositional contexts in the enclosure. It is the only enclosure in Algarve, and it has a necropolis area that's associated with it, in which 3 other vessels were found. Porto Torrão is still quite unknown to the archaeological community, since it was excavated by different teams without any data compilation. Nonetheless, it has one of the biggest sets of decorated bell beakers in southern Portugal, with more than 400 sherds, mainly from the international and the geometric dotted type, and so far it has been connected more to the Portuguese Extremadura contact networks and not so much with the Alentejo ones and the Central Iberian ones. Perdigões is widely known, we've talked about this site here already. It has an intensively publication during the last 20 years of the project, with beakers being basically identified every year in the excavations. They are mainly focused on the central enclosures, but so far we have a minimum number of at least 60 vessels. It has a large set of beakers from all styles, all shapes, and we also have regional motifs, not only Simpos Velus, but we also found paired fingernail imprints and bottle cap motifs that were already presented in other beaker conference. Besides that, what we can see in this site is that human groups are in fact rethinking, recreating, and reusing the beaker shape, using it for other decorations, but they are also reusing the techniques and the motifs that are usually traditional associated with the beaker phenomena. Besides those, and here in the back, we have also Monte da Contenda, that it's the 5th enclosure in which we found decorated bell beakers. But first, let me present to you Santa Vitória. Santa Vitória is a ditched enclosure in Campo-Maior, quite close to Spain. It was the first of its kind to be identified and excavated in Portugal during the 80s and the 90s of the 20th century. It is made up of two sinuous ditches, with a total perimetry of the inner ditch already previously known. While the outer ditch was only identified in the entrance area, and this entrance is orientated to the north. However, little was known beyond these generic characteristics about its architecture. So we know that the inner ditch is made up of 6 standardized lobes, and it has an entrance that faces the summer solstice. The outer ditch was only partially excavated, and the entrance, as I already mentioned, is facing north. The outer ditch, so we don't have any publications for this site from the previous excavations. So basically creating a research project for Santa Vitória, it was like starting from scratch in a site that it was almost abandoned and full of vegetation. We came up with the project temporalities, architectures, and social practices in a ditched enclosure. We called it Sanvit, and it lasted from 2018 to 2021. And we wanted to apply a scientific questionnaire to the archaeological site and compare the social dynamics and the temporalities of a small enclosure with those that have been recorded in a large complex such as Perdigões. So one of the first tasks that we did by going to Santa Vitória, it was trying to recognize the planimetry of the outer ditch, and we used geophysics. This work was carried out by Tiago do Pereiro, that you can also see in the image, and is part of our research team, and we basically came up with 7 30 by 30 meters square. The results that we got are quite significant, although the quality of the image has been strongly affected by the existence of nails. You can see they are all aligned over here, and also by metal rubbish that it was spread through the site all over the years. However, we can more or less see the outlines of ditch 2, except in the southwest quadrant, so we didn't got any information here. Although diffuse, it is possible to see a sinuous layout that it's made up of at least 10 lobes. This complexifies a little bit the image that it was first taught to Santa Vitória. It was interpreted as a settlement, so we do know have other interpretations for the site, and it was drawn as having 6 extremely long lobes, and now we know that it has more. So the excavations covered the main 2 features of the site. Ditch 1 was already partially excavated by the previous teams, and we found in the parts that we had stratigraphy preserved 2 major moments that define the filling of the structure. So the first and the oldest corresponds to a succession of deposits that are essentially horizontalized. The second phase is marked by the presence of a shallow recutting that is filled with 3 moments of ceramic depositions, stone elements, and scarce faunal remains. After this, a depression was formed, and it was filled with a stone concentration, without a very defined shape. After this, this type of concentration has already been identified in previous reports, and it was interpreted as being the remains of habitational structures, huts. We also were able to find an orchestrated and almost normative deposition in the entrance, close to the entrance, so that you can see over here, because we found depositions in 3 different moments of phalanges and fragments of the same horned idol. It's an artifact that we have in Portugal, so it's a ceramic artifact. But it was fragmented and deposited in 3 different moments, always associated with phalange. In ditch 2, this structure hadn't been almost intervened, so we had access to the full stratigraphy. We were able to detect that through the same lobe, there are different depositional moments with different depths, and that the junction of lobes, at least in the excavated case, reflects different filling behaviors. However, if in ditch 1 we only found a section of the top filling with stones, in the ditch 2 we found a quite significant and extensive depositions of stone on top of the structure that we think it might serve to mark the presence of the structure in previous periods. Other goal of this project was to produce the first C14 dates for this enclosure. So due to the general plan previously known, we were kind of already expecting later dates into the 3rd millennia BC. Naturally, we don't know how long it was between the first opening of the structures and the filling, and even if they were eventually filled and then cleaned and then refilled again. Nonetheless, we know that during the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, Santa Vitória was fully active and being used. This makes both the structure that we found in Santa Vitória contemporary of a phase where the Beaker phenomenon is already regionally present and established. If we only focus our approach on the materials, they seem to suggest something different. They are quite traditionalist, with the technological features compatible with the later phase. We have seen a decrease in the productive investment in ceramic artifacts, creating coarser ceramics with more non-plastic elements, tending to present darker surfaces. So, in other words, the artifacts seem to materialize changes that we already noted, for example, in the later materials of Portugal, but without the presence of the decorated beakers or even decorated elements in general. So, in this sense, there seems to be a deliberate choice in the materials that are deposited in Santa Vitória, but also in the ones that are absent. So, in this sense, where are the beakers then? So let me now pass on to Monte Contenda, in which you already know that we have Bell Beakers. So Monte Contenda is located just 4 kilometers away from Santa Vitória, so these two enclosures are super close. It was discovered at the end of 2013 through the aerial images from Google and Bing Maps as a part of the research project into Alentejo Dites enclosure that is being carried out by the Archaeological Research Center of Archaeology. This complex has already been subject of several archaeological works, most of which were non-intrusive, namely that 2 geophysical prospections it was restricted to the most central area of the enclosure, and the other covered the entire site and its outskirts. One of the ditches, it was also cut by the road that goes through the enclosure, and it was also surveyed. So you can see numerous overlapping structures and intersecting ditches that document the diachronic nature of these constructions. Given the mixed nature of the geophysical images, it is difficult to establish chronological relationships. However, by combining the designs defined by the groups of ditches with the distribution of materials, we can define 2 large groups. We have the ditches that define longer enclosures of larger dimensions that are marked in green, and we also have the group of enclosures that seems to be more concentrated in the center, with a more circular and concentric tendency that are marked in black. In 2021, during the execution of the Sunvid project, we did a surface prospection in Monte Contenda, and we created an imaginary grid that follows the olive trees that are planted in the site. The long biography of these archaeological structures are also detected in the magnetogram, also are reflected in the materials, which clearly show different cultural influences and tendencies, as well as different spheres of the social practices of the communities responsible for their constructions. So we have materials that could be ascribed to the daily activities, but we also have symbolic artifacts. The dates obtained through the intervention in ditch 1 allowed us to understand that this structure was being filled during the second half of the 4th millennia BC, in contemporaneity with some of the oldest structures that we found in Portugal, giving us a chronological span that ranges from the 4th millennia to the beginning of the 2nd millennia BC. The amount of materials collected in the survey that we carried out during the Sunvid project illustrates the longevity of the site, since we found 33,283 fragments of ceramic alone. Other materials that are also present in Monte Contenda are, for example, 145 polished stone remains, 63 loom weights, and even 15 symbolic artifacts and 8 metallurgical elements. Thus, even without any archaeological excavation, Monte Contenda already has elements of all artifactual categories in a much greater number than we have in Santa Vitória, where we only have a total of 2,083 artifacts. Now, beakers. So focusing now on the Bell Beakers, in the survey we found 14 sherds, and even though we don't have a large set, this set could be used as an example set for the Bell Beaker presence in Alentejo. As you can see, we have all beaker styles. So we have international, geometric dotted, and we also have the local varieties of simples velos. Regarding the morphology, we have the traditional S-shaped vessels, but we also have shouldered bowls and simple bowls. This representativity emphasizes that either the communities or individuals that visited Monte da Contenda had access to the circulation networks of these elements and were integrated into them, or that the site itself was a participatory agent in one of these influence networks. But what can the archaeological landscape where both Monte da Contenda and Santa Vitória are located tell us? So, as part of a region in Portugal with a high density of sites with decorated Bell Beaker elements, namely Alentejo, Monte da Contenda appears somewhat isolated, with its nearest beaker neighbor at 29 and 39 kilometers away to the west and to the southwest, namely Pombal and Terrugem habitats. Is this isolation a reflection of a lower population density during the Chalcolithic in the Monte da Contenda and Santa Vitória areas? In fact, the number of archaeological sites in the region is small, with few funerary contexts, and it's also being poorly characterized and researched. Even so, neither Santa Vitória nor Monte da Contenda are archaeologically isolated, and an intense human presence can be inferred from the artifactual and constructive density present at Contenda, even if they could be diluted through a long biography of the site. As such, this possible scarcity of Bell Beakers regionally may be due to a more peripheral implementation regarding what seem to be the main lines of contact and exchange between the Chalcolithic communities of the peninsular south, in which these elements and ideas seem to have navigated. These networks seem to have followed the settlement systems that were defined in the influential areas of what are the great peninsular enclosures, namely Porto Torrão, Perdigões, San Blas, and Pirrotilha. However, given the complexity of Monte da Contenda and its significant material density, could this site be another center of exchange and aggregation that is yet to be defined? What is certain is that the Bell Beakers of all types were recorded in this enclosure, replicating, once again, the behavior detected in larger enclosures, such as Perdigões, but contrasting with the neighboring sites of Pombal and Terrugem, which both have exclusively monothematic representations of simples velos shirts. So, with a direct comparison between the two enclosures, it is clear that Santa Vitória demonstrates an intentional choice of materials deposited. Artifacts that would typically be associated with daily activities, such as loom weights, grinding elements, or even common lithic utensils, are absent. All of these are abundantly present at Monte da Contenda. Another fracturing point is the artifactual density, emphasizing the capacity for aggregation and attraction of people and materials on Contenda versus a possibly more local agency and functionality of Santa Vitória. These characteristics and differences emphasize the notable absence of beakers, which don't seem to find acceptance in groups at a more macro level. Even so, this behavior seems to be not just the exception, but starts to be a trend that can increasingly be associated with sites with smaller enclosures defined by sinuous ditches with compatible chronologies, namely Outeiro Alto, Horta do Albardão, or even Bela Vista 5, that you can find the information here in the slides. They are closer to Santa Vitória dynamics than the ones we identified in Monte da Contenda. So a pattern starts to build, connecting much smaller enclosures with an apparently smaller scale of influence, which seem to resort to more local raw materials, excluding the beaker elements, and basically trying to keep the traditional social practices alive. In addition to the beaker obliteration, the maintenance of solar cycles expressed in the planimetry and orientation of these new enclosures emphasize this possible attempt to link to Neolithic behaviors and identities as if mimicking the practices of their ancestors. These phenomena of resistance are a human feature, creating situations of strong opposition with extremely opposite sides. Examples can include abortion legalization, women being able to vote, the philosophies and lifestyles of hippie communities, and even the debate around gay marriage. Transposing these defining and structuring issues oppose, on the one hand, more traditionalist groups who, because they don't agree with the new ideas, perceiving them as fracturing affronts to the existing reality, fight against their implementation and generalized acceptance, and opposes them to more modern groups exposed to new ideas and environments who want to change the world according to their perspectives to the better. Transposing this to the case study of Santa Vitória, could the absence of beaker ceramics be used as an identity trace to these groups? Are they refusing to accept being part of a world that's undergoing rapid change, in which previous practices are being called into question, reinvented, and replaced by new behaviors that include and integrate new material and cultural expressions? Could it be that these characteristics has led to a phenomenon of social exclusion and inequality, turning these communities into a kind of outsiders, as it happens, for example, with the EPs? What might be certain is that, as in the case of the house in the first image of the slide, coexistence, even if strange or atypical, could be possible, with places like Portugal exemplifying such coexistence. We have new behaviors that integrate decorated bell beakers, like pot depositions in the central enclosure, that coexist with reopening practices that were marking previous structures, like it happens in ditch 1 and ditch 7, through the deposition of stone elements, perpetuating past narratives and agencies without beakers present. So integrating the new without neglecting the link with the past. So to conclude, in Santa Vitória, we can assume that the depositions identified are orchestrated. As such, the absence of decorated beakers is significant. If it could be explained by the regional unavailability of these ceramics, the discoveries at Monte da Contenda allow us to refute this premise, emphasizing the possible existence of networks yet to be detected in the Upper Alentejo, or that the existence of the existing networks have a much extensive influence with arrival of these novelties at more peripheral points of what are considered the Alentejo aggregation centers more located to the south. If the existence of signs materializes the presence of symbolism and meaning behind those representations, their absence can also be explained by the intentional desire not to be associated with the ideas represented and the meanings. There may be many causes for this split, but in the case of Santa Vitória, its existence in the last quarter of the 3rd millennium BC makes it contemporary with a series of social, cultural, and environmental changes that will culminate in the archaeological disappearance of these groups and their materialities. At a time when previous traditions were collapsing, with aggregation sites apparently being abandoned, exchange networks ceasing to function, and profound changes in funerary practices, the metamorphosis of the social and identity systems would be radical, potentially giving rise to processes of social tension, reinvention of communities and individuals themselves on the one hand, and on the other, processes of resistance and revival of traditions and practices in an almost attempt to save what might remain. Thus, the exclusion of beakers can possibly be thought of as a phenomenon of identity affirmation from groups with a Neolithic tradition in response to external influences and the beginning of the failure of the ongoing social trajectories. They would use the past, whether in the form of the architecture, the materials, or the depositional practices, as a tool to try to safeguard their future. However, according to the available archaeological data, these efforts seem to have been unsuccessful, since Neo-Chalcolithic practices did in fact collapse. So what we know is that neither being part of the Bell Beaker phenomenon nor resisting it allowed the southern Portuguese communities to reinvent themselves and thrive during the beginning of the Bronze Age, which so far is one of the biggest unknowns in the Portuguese prehistory. Thank you so much.